Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Tom Woods Show, episode 2507 with Chris Coyne. We're going to be talking about his latest book, co-authored book called How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. Chris is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute and co-editor of the Independent Review, as well as professor of economics at George Mason University, associate director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center, and co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. He's the author of numerous books, several of which we've discussed on this program. But today, I love the idea behind this book. I'm looking forward to talking about how to run wars. So welcome back, Chris.
Oh, well, thank you, Tom. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
So how'd you get the idea for this kind of tongue-in-cheek, clever, kind of, in a way, almost playful approach to this subject?
Yeah, well, we'll start by saying, kind of giving it away up front, which is the book is satirical. And that's not evident from page one of the book until you get perhaps towards the end, but that's the style. And actually, the inspiration was an economist that is very rarely talked about, Bruce Winton Knight, who was Frank Knight's brother, the famous Frank Knight of Chicago. He actually came from a family of economists. He's, of course, the most famous. But while he was at Chicago, one of his brothers was a professor of economics at Berkeley. The other, Bruce Winton Knight, was a professor of economics at Dartmouth. And one of the books that Bruce Winton Knight published in 1936 was called How to Run a War. And it was a tongue-in-cheek look at what was required to operate and succeed in war making. And someone mentioned this book to me in passing, and when I read it, I was just blown away in terms of the style and the effectiveness. So my co-author and I decided to write a updated version of it, both in terms of arguments and evidence.
Well, I love the idea because now that you mention it, when you look back, particularly on recent conflicts, it's almost as if they're following some kind of perverse playbook because it's all so familiar and repeated every single time, all the various features that you talk about in this book. It is as if they're following some kind of playbook, but it's a playbook out of the Bizarro world or, out of Opposite Day from SpongeBob or something.
Yeah, so, I mean, it almost wrote itself, the book, and it's sad to say, but you just look around the world with all the wars, and it's not just wars with military equipment, but also the war on drugs, war on COVID, war on everything, and it almost writes itself. So the sad part is it's satirical. That's the fun part. The sad part is it's true.
So that's right. Well, all right. So let's dig into some of what's in here, and I really do recommend this book to folks because you can. It's not a long book, and in this day and age, this age of YouTube Shorts, that is a virtue, but it is packed with information and examples of the various phenomena that you're describing in action over the past many years. And I mean, sometimes you go all the way back to World War I.
That's right.
For your examples. But let's dig in with some of the initial phenomena that you talk about in the book. And so, for example, making sure that you control the narrative. Now, the narrative, that term has, I think, come into popular usage only somewhat recently. That is to say, there is a version of events that we want to take hold in people's minds as the official, accepted version of events, and we want to make sure that version of events has few challenges and is the dominant way of understanding what's going on. So in the age of the internet, it seems much more difficult to, quote, control the narrative because one meme can ridicule you to pieces. So how do they go about that?
Sure. Well, first, I think it's important to step back and say all governments, irrespective of the location, type, and so on, require support from the public. Even the most authoritarian governments require public support, whether that's active support or indifference, or they can't sustain and operate. And so war making of all types requires the populace to get on board. And that leads to this idea of controlling the narrative. And so government has to continually, number one, make clear to people that there's threats around every corner. if you don't grant us more power, if you don't let us undertake programs A, B, and C, and initiatives X, Y, and Z, your liberties, your freedom, the future of the world is at stake. That's number one. And then, of course, once you get into specific instances of government interventions, both domestically and internationally, then you have to craft that narrative. And as you mentioned correctly, times have changed. During World War I, World War II, it was easier from the standpoint that people had less access to information. And so they relied on traditional newspapers, radio, film in order to gather information. And they still do rely on those things. But now we have access to more information than ever. But so does government. And that's the challenge. And you saw this with, of course, the war on terror, but especially with COVID, you saw governments, the US government, attempting to partner with, and in many cases partnering with, and influencing and pressuring social media companies to police information, to monitor information, and to, in many cases, block information from being spread because it wasn't the official narrative. And one of the ways government does this is to kind of push people into buckets. And so if you're not on board with the official narrative, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're unpatriotic, you're un-American, and so on. And we've seen this repeatedly. And so these tools are still at government's disposals. And so too is the collection and control of information. And so it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you can log on to the internet and gather more information than ever. On the other hand, so too can government, and they can try to manipulate and influence you through the control of that information.
In this day and age, when it comes to the outright suppression of dissident voices, we don't have anything quite as obnoxious, of course, as for example, what happened to Eugene V. Debs during World War I. We don't have anything quite like the Creel Committee or people on street corners barking propaganda at us. But is it possible that nevertheless we have something more subtle at work?
Yes, that's exactly how I would put it. So you're certainly right that in some sense, the U.S. government has wisened up, if you can give them credit for that. In that, in these past instances, they were very blatant about what they were doing. As you put it, the Committee on Public Information and so on, they literally created agencies and said, the purpose of these agencies is to provide the American public with the official narrative and information about the war. And they didn't blush about it in the least. They just did their thing. They don't do that anymore. Now it's a lot more subtle. So what you have is things like, as I was just saying, influence over social media. You have influence over even televised media. And so one of the things that the George W. Bush administration did during the war on terror, which we discuss in the book, was to give talking points to people that were presented as objective experts, many of whom, of course, had ties within the military-industrial complex. They would go on cable news, repeat these points, and then the Bush administration officials would cite those individuals as credible experts who were doing things, of course, that were in line with what the administration wanted to do. Of course, the other thing, which is subtle yet all around us, is the entanglement between the Pentagon and various forms of entertainment. That's sporting events, that is Hollywood movies, that's television, and the partnerships which have long existed between the Defense Department and these various branches of the entertainment industry. And we don't pay attention to most of these things. I like action movies just as much as the next person. But it's very easy to overlook the fact that in many cases, the Pentagon has influence over the content of these entertainment features that we're watching and can influence how we're thinking about them.
At one point in the book, you say that somebody who should be very much imitated, and again, imagine that it's like screw tape here, I suppose, that we don't really say that this should be imitated, but if you want to carry on in the same way as in the past, you should want to imitate how George W. Bush handled this matter of capturing the media. And it really is true that certainly the first George Bush had absolute domination of the media in the sense that you really could find no dissent on that initial Persian Gulf War at all. I mean, just nothing.
That's right.
Noam Chomsky was having a field day pointing out that this was a validation of his whole thesis. Now, George W. Bush wasn't quite that successful, but still, nevertheless, everybody seemed to be on board in terms of all the purveyors of respectable opinion. But how and why?
Yeah, well, I think what happens often is that people end up in an echo chamber from the following standpoint. Again, the government says, look, there's a threat around the corner. So post 9/11, remember the original claims. The original claims was terrorists are everywhere. So these are not outlier situations, but a genuine threat, not just to the long-term safety, security of political institutions in the United States, but to our being our ordinary citizens, our safety and livelihood. And so if we don't turn power over to government, both domestically and internationally, we're doomed, and your kids are doomed. And that's fear. That's fear-mongering. Threat inflation is the fancy word that's used among academics, because it takes into account or fails to take into account the realistic likelihood and probabilities of these events happening. And of course, the beauty of the war on terror from the perspective of government is that it was a global war with a faceless enemy. And so it wasn't that you were abroad fighting groups, targeted groups, which of course they were, but any one of us could have been a potential suspect, a potential terrorist, which makes us all subject to surveillance and control. And so then, of course, you get the run up to the war, and you have what's going on in Afghanistan, the invasion of Afghanistan, but then, of course, Iraq. And of course, the claims were very strong that Saddam Hussein had full knowledge of 9/11, that he was partnering with Al-Qaeda, and that he was involved with 9/11, and that he had weapons of mass destruction that threatened not just the safety of people in the region of Iraq, but Americans as well. And so you can certainly see how that threat inflation, combined with the rawness of the actual events on 9/11, which affected Americans throughout the country, led to strong support for the Bush administration to do what they did. But of course, then they had to maintain that support. And the way they did it was partially through what you and I were just discussing, through putting these experts, supposed experts on TV and parroting talking points, through putting, of course, high-level officials, Condoleezza Rice, Dick Cheney, regularly on the media, because of course these individuals kind of have authority and legitimacy because they're top level officials. But then of course the other thing that happens is the media during war becomes an extension of government. It becomes a force multiplier, as some people refer to it, of the American military. And it does so not just by sitting there and inviting these experts and political officials to say what they're going to say to the American public, but also they're on the ground reporting. So one of the things we talk about in the book is this idea of embedding, of putting members of the media with military troops on the ground. And this sounds wonderful. It sounds like a way to get to the front lines, but it's actually very strategically curated by members of the U.S. military to make what they are doing look good, legitimate, and so on. And by shielding members of the media from all of the actual dirty and nefarious activities that are a necessary part of war. And so you get this concerted effort to shape the information that's flowing back to the American public. It's very carefully curated. And then, of course, as we started, you get these competing dissenting voices, but you can't have that. So you have to have a concerted effort to make these people look bad by discrediting them and by making them look like fools.
Hey, everybody, here's how to unlock a 12% return on silver. Most of the time, you buy gold and silver and you just sit there with it. Now, that's better than what most people do, which is not buying any gold and silver. But thanks to Monetary Metals, where our old friend Jeff Deist is now, you can put those precious metals to work for you. Silver, by the way, is a tangible asset, a great way to diversify any investment portfolio. But with Monetary Metals, you don't just own physical silver. You own silver that works for you to generate more silver, growing your total ounces over time. Well, as I said, you can now earn 12% annual interest on silver, paid in silver, in their latest offering if you are an accredited investor. Click the link in the description or just head to tomwoods.com/silver to learn more. You've heard me talk about Monetary Metals plenty. I've had an account there myself for about 2 years, and they are revolutionizing the way we invest in gold and silver. They've been paying interest on gold and silver for over 8 years, and that helps you grow your wealth in real, tangible assets. You want a true alternative to saving in the dollar? Well, you've got it. You can generate a yield on gold and silver with monetary metals. Head over to tomwoods.com/silver to find out more. I actually want to skip ahead a bit, and then we'll come back, because I was struck by your chapter on don't admit failure, and that can take multiple forms. It can take the form of things are going wrong because we didn't get the cooperation we expected from such and such ally, or a big long series of things. And also that awful, I don't think it's from that chapter, but that awful way people exploit Americans' good nature by saying these soldiers cannot have been allowed to die in vain, which is another way of saying we can never, ever stop this. Because then otherwise Uncle Ted over here will have died for no good reason. And so we have to just keep on going and going and going. So never admit failure. So what forms does that take?
Right. And so, in general, if you just watch politics, politicians rarely, if ever, admit that they've made a mistake. And that's good politics. You want to communicate and project a sense of infallibility, that I am kind of above the people in terms of leadership and doing what needs to be done to improve their welfare. And of course, admitting that you're wrong about something, that you can't do something, that you've made a grave mistake, is highly problematic from that perspective. And so one of the things when we're laying out this guidebook to the national security lead, again, in a mocking way, is to say, no matter what you do, never admit failure. You are the savior of the world. You are infallible. The people need you. And all of your messaging needs to be bound up in that way of thinking. And so anytime something goes wrong, you look for scapegoats. And there's many. Domestically, there's the other political party. So if you're on the Republican side of the aisle, you can say the Democrats, they were the ones that mucked up the works. If they hadn't gotten in the way, things would have been better. And vice versa, if you're on the Democratic side of the aisle. Internationally, you can look at international organizations, you can look at other governments, and perhaps the most common technique, which you certainly saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, is to blame the people on the ground, the people you are intervening upon. And so one of the comparisons we make in the book, because this isn't a bipartisan strategy, is between George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And we quote both of them at various times, one in the case of Afghanistan, one in the case of Iraq, saying, we gave them the chance to be free and they blew it. If they had just accepted what we were offering them, we would have succeeded and their lives would have been better off. And of course, that's nice when you're trying to insulate yourself from any responsibility. You simply blame others. The downside of that, of course, is you completely lack any kind of self-awareness, self-reflection, or humility, because you never ask yourself, well, wait a second, maybe I can't do what I claim that I am going to do. And of course, the danger of that isn't just failure, but you actually can ruin the lives of innocent human beings, both abroad and at home, but also make people less safe. And my co-author and I would argue that's exactly what happens. The other thing that you mentioned, which I think is quite important, is this idea of, people died in vain, therefore we can never leave. Economists call this the sunk cost fallacy. The economist Kenneth Bolden called this the sacrifice trap in war, which is that you never want to admit that you failed. So you keep saying, well, people died, therefore we must keep doing it. The problem with this, of course, is that no matter what you do, you can't get the people that have died back, no matter how tragic it is. The risk you run is that you'll kill more people. And that is what's important for making the decision. The problem is that political decision makers don't internalize the costs of their decisions. They push them off on other people by blaming others. And so the incentive is always to keep going, to throw good money after bad, to throw additional human lives after the loss of other human lives that took place in the past because of bad decisions. And this is a very difficult position to get out of once you're in it.
No doubt. And I think another factor involved, and I can't prove this, but is that so many people are in the military that there are very few families who don't have a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or a coworker in the military. And so then military policy becomes a personal matter to them. And that if you say, well, I don't support this particular military intervention, then it's like you're insulting them personally.
Sure. I think that's part of it. And the other part of it is a bandwagon effect. I think once
Yes.
people start saying this, you don't want to be the person that says, well, wait a second, what about not doing this? Maybe we shouldn't continue to do this, because once people start accepting, it doesn't take many people to get the bandwagon going. That kind of logic that you just laid out, that they know someone or they have some personal stake and they say, well, we must keep doing this. People oftentimes are hesitant to engage in that conversation, to push back because of various social pressures. And government works very hard to make that happen, by the way, to instill a sense of patriotism and compliance among the people. And that's always been the case, from outright propaganda during the world wars to the adoption of certain ribbons and so on since, to the various kind of rituals and actions that take place before sporting events that are attempt to kind of instill this patriotism and common knowledge among people to get them on board with the grand endeavor.
So let's talk about the section on undermining liberty in the name of liberty. And so we can think about things that are done on the domestic front that are familiar enough to us, that are obviously a consequence of all the military interventions. So, in 1887, the U.S. did not need the Patriot Act. I mean, in 2024, it doesn't need the Patriot Act, but you couldn't even plausibly make a case for it in those days.
That's right.
Or the TSA, for example. And I think, by the way, as my kids grow up, that they have no idea what it's like to have lived before any of this, when you could just walk through and nobody was making unreasonable demands of you or putting their hand down your pants or whatever. But some people may say to you that, look, I know that on paper you could be justifiably concerned about the Patriot Act. Now, these are people who are very charitable. They may say, I could see on paper, but in practice, it hardly affects anybody. Really, unless you are seriously involved in something really screwed up, you have nothing to worry about with the Patriot Act. And the TSA is at most a minor inconvenience. So this is not totalitarianism. So what are you all worried about?
Yep. And that's common. One of the most common phrases you'll hear people say is exactly that. I have nothing to hide, therefore what's the big deal? It's a few extra minutes. It's not pleasant, but for our safety, it's worth it. And there's a couple responses to that. One is the practical response, which is, okay, well, let's see how effective these things are. And so in the case of the TSA, for instance, we know that the TSA, based on their own tests, by the way, because they test themselves or they are tested by hiring outside people to try to smuggle things through security. And if you look at the failure rates of these tests, they are enormous. They are something like 75, 85%, in some cases even higher, of getting things through security. And so on practical grounds, it's highly questionable whether it's effective. But beyond that, and perhaps more importantly, we have to think about the long-term consequences. And so, if we borrow something from the great thinker Alexis de Tocqueville, the distinction between hard despotism and soft despotism. Hard despotism, according to Tocqueville, is the brutal authoritarianism that is in your face. That's people being simply arrested, sent to the gulag, or killed because they violated something that their political masters didn't find appealing. And that is hard because it's hard despotism because it's in your face. It's readily observable, and it's terrible. But Tocqueville pointed out that perhaps the greater threat to a free society is soft despotism. This idea of death by 1,000 cuts, that these small little changes that happen through time, many of which we either don't perceive or are like, in the grand scheme of things, that's not really that big of a deal. But through time, they do become a big deal. And it's very hard to undo them once they are done. Part of that is because you have a government bureau in place, or bureaus plural, which is always hard to undo. But the other point is the exact one you raised in the context of your kids, which is the same for me. I have a 12 and a 5-year-old, and ideologically, they will never know what pre-9/11 airport security looks like, or what that experience was. I can tell them, but that's just another instance of there's dad telling us stories from the past, whatever kind of thing. And that's really challenging because what we have to realize is each infringement on our liberty changes our ideology or belief system, the way we perceive the relationship between the citizen and the state. Even if those of us, yourself, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but I can speak to you as someone who's very concerned about liberty. Myself, I go through the airport and even now I'm like, I got to deal with this, but let me just get through this. And we're people that think about these things, think about these infringements on liberty. And so I would try to push back against people that kind of raise that indifference and say, well, you got to really be careful. Frank Church, the senator of the Church Committee, when the great revelations were made about the surveillance state, thanks to Daniel Ellsberg and those that he worked with, he said something. He headed up the committee, of course, that investigated these violations, constitutional violations due to surveillance. And one of the things that he pointed out was that, look, we don't think this is a tyranny right now, but you have to understand the breadth of this. If certain people got in charge of government, they would have access to all of your information. And this, of course, was well before the Snowden revelations, well before advances in technology that we have today. So we have to understand that even if we don't see it in front of us, it's happening or can happen. And in some sense, that makes it even more dangerous and even more reason to be concerned.
Let's shift gears. Given that you are a professor of economics, let's say something about the kind of economic planning that goes on during wartime. Now, this is another case where the modern day counterpart of all this might be more subtle, because in World War I, you had very, very clear. I mean, obviously, World War I was a conflict on a much, much greater scope than anything the U.S. is involved in now. But there you had massive government involvement in the economy in one way or another. And in fact, the editors of the New Republic magazine welcomed the intervention in World War I, not simply because they believed that internationally it was the righteous thing to do, but also because they believed that it would constitute an excellent case study. Well, not case study. I take that back. It would be a precedent for the future, and it would get stupid, backward, old-fashioned, laissez-faire Americans to understand the role that an activist government can play. First, in the case of World War I, in bringing about military victory, but if it's capable of that, then after the war, maybe we might have a heavier government involvement in the economy. We definitely had that in the past, but today, the economic side of this seems more subtle. It seems more just like higher taxes or more inflation.
Yep, exactly. And interestingly, even before World War I, many of the early models of socialism, I mean full-on economic planning of all economic activity from people like Otto Neurath, who was a classmate of Ludwig von Mises, was based on the war economy. They said, look, during wartime, government centralizes enormous power over the economy. They take resources from people, they force them to work, they produce wonderful outputs. Why don't we just take that same logic and extend it from tanks and guns and so on to consumer goods as well? And this will be wonderful. And so that should tell you something, if anything, that the very idea of wartime planning is central planning. That is what it entails, hierarchical, top-down control by government. Now, as you rightly note, during the World Wars, there was a massive expansion of government control over economic activity. Private property was confiscated. Government subsidized and actually funded enormous factories to produce wartime production. And of course, there was rationing of basic food items, meats, dairy, in addition to rubber and so on. People were encouraged to grow victory gardens. Of course, there's propaganda for you, as if somehow moving back to subsistence living and growing your own food is somehow good for the freedom of the country and the world and so on. Now we don't have that. But here's what we do have. Post collapse of the Soviet Union, really actually post World War II, I should go back to. So World War II ends and the war economy shrunk in aggregate terms, meaning the amount of resources at that moment being spent fell. But what happened is we got something called the permanent war economy. And what happened is that the government said, well, wait, we can't let this happen again. Now we're the world's police. So we can't wait for the next war to happen. We need to continually prepare. And so we need to invest in what they refer to as the defense industrial base. That's the military sector and all that's involved in it, in order to prepare for future wars. And that has never gone away. And a thinker, of course, that you and I have discussed before, and we admire his work on this topic, Seymour Melman, wrote a great deal on this, about the parasitic effects of the permanent war economy on economic life and on the economic system itself, which means that it shifts the economic system from one of free market capitalism to political capitalism. These entanglements between the private sector and the public sector, the military, industrial, congressional complex, and all that's involved in that. And so what you have gotten through time is, as you put it nicely, a subtle shift from economic planning that is very blunt and in your face to a shift that's more subtle in terms of constant government entanglements throughout economic life. And let me just say one more thing to make this clear. In order to run this massive empire, it's not just Boeing. It's not just Lockheed Martin. Those are big players. But understand what happens. You need office supplies. You need insurance. You need accountants, and so on. And so government has contracts with all of these firms throughout the entire economy, many of which we would consider mundane producers. And it influences and affects everything. And very few people talk about this. In fact, if you talk to politicians, they say, no, we are staunch supporters of capitalism and markets. But really, the very kind of requirement of running the government apparatus entails top-down economic planning.
Hey, folks, we've all been there. Mealtime can be stressful. You're busy. You want to eat well, but you're tired. You just can't bear the idea of dirtying up the kitchen yet again. Maybe you don't have the ingredients you need. So then you're tempted to just go ahead and order food that you know you probably shouldn't be eating. And then you struggle with this every single day. Like, how can it possibly be dinner time already again? Well, a great solution to this is Factor. You certainly won't get bored with Factor. Get over 35 different options a week to choose from to have delivered straight to your door. That includes keto, calorie smart, vegan and veggie, and more. It's easier than ever to have a week's worth of meals ready to go, no stress. Pause or reschedule your deliveries anytime. Factor's restaurant quality meals are ready to heat and eat whenever you are. And it's not just dinner, by the way. You'll discover a whole variety of easy options for the entire day. So breakfast, midday bites, and more. Factor's delicious meals are less expensive than takeout, and they're much better for you. It's the perfect solution if you're looking for fast, upscale options done easily. And there's no kitchen to deal with because there's no prepping, cooking, or cleanup needed. Factor's meals are 100% ready to heat and eat. So head to factormeals.com/woods50 and use code WOODS50 to get 50% off. That's code WOODS50 at factormeals.com/woods50 to get 50% off. You know, I'm glad you mentioned Seymour Melman because, you know, I've had an interest in him. And one of the things he said that struck me in particular was there are only so many people who have the smarts to be involved in research and development for, let's say, new consumer products. There are only so many people. It's not like if we divert 1/3 of them or 2/3 of them to some other thing, that other ones will just pop up and replace them. You know, it's like Homer Simpson's got his arms in the vending machine and they're considering cutting them off. And he says, they'll grow back, right? Of course, they don't grow back. And likewise for people in research and development. And he was saying that 2/3 of the research and development talent in the U.S. was siphoned away into the military sector. So now we'll never know what advances that, you know, might have contributed to our actual comforts might have occurred that did not occur. So I guess the thing that is frustrating to me is you can write a book like this that more or less says, as I said at the beginning, it's like they're operating these wars according to a playbook because every unforced error they make, they made the last time and the time before that. And each time it has dreadful results. And yet the general public seems to be on board for the next one and on board for the next one. Now, it does seem that some cynicism and skepticism have crept in. with to the American consciousness. But even so, you would think, given the recent track record. In fact, I was just interviewing Dan McCarthy the other day, and he was interacting with David Frum on Twitter and saying, what region of the world has become more liberal, prosperous, and stable because of these interventions? And I don't know what the answer is. And I guess I'm glad, better late than never, that the American public seems to be, feeling like they have a case of buyer's remorse with some of the wars. But I wonder if it would. I still feel like it wouldn't take that much to get them on board again.
I agree, and so I share your optimism on one margin and worried on other margins. Meaning that if you think about it, so you get 9/11. Of course, we go back well before this, and we've talked a little bit about it. But let's just start at 9/11. You get decades-long war, and now we know from things like the Afghanistan papers and other documents that have become public that throughout this, the members of the U.S. government just knew this was a disaster. It was not working, yet it kept churning. And then you get the exit under Biden, which of course the Trump administration prior had played a role in getting us to that point. And I thought at that point, okay, this is at the exit of Afghanistan. So you get the exit was chaos, and of course very quickly everything that was left, of course, that the U.S. had done collapsed almost immediately. So talk about failure and the spread of liberalism. It's not even like you got a month. Like, what did we purchase for trillions of dollars and lives lost? It was days, and the entire apparatus had literally collapsed in Afghanistan. So at that moment, I thought to myself, okay, anyone that sees this, no matter what their ideology, no matter what their interests, whether they have no interest in foreign policy, they're going to have to say to themselves, like, this is a disaster. I cannot imagine a bigger disaster. But of course, the window for that self-reflection closed very quickly. You get Russia, Ukraine, now Israel, Palestine. And so my skepticism, of course, I'm an optimist, so I write books like this to help to try to inform people and get them thinking at least, is that we seem to jump from conflict to conflict very quickly. And it's almost like the flavor of the week. And there's a lot we don't even talk about. Libya, Syria, and all these other, I hesitate to call them minor because there's human beings involved, but they're minor from the standpoint we really don't read about them much or hear about them much in the United States.
So what kind of, you write a book like this and we read it and we say that, wow, these authors have pinpointed patterns that I myself didn't notice that seem to pop up every time we get swept into some war. What can we as the general public do?
Yeah, so I think this. First of all, I think each of us have our roles to play. My role as an academic, I research, I write, I teach, and so I try to communicate. There's multi-talented or in sports 5-tool players like yourself who, of course, can do the academics and the writing, but also communicate to a whole host of audiences in a very effective way. And so each of us have our role to play in communicating ideas. And so my hope with this is number one, people will read it and think. And so, of course, as we mentioned at the outset, it's written as a guidebook to the national security elite, but it's really written to the every person. And what we want people to walk away with is wait a second, this is a really terrible enterprise in itself. And I really need to reflect on this. And I have more control over influencing things than I think I do. And once that step is taken, then we can start thinking about what they can do. And of course, I think part of that maybe is political, but politics, it can get things done, but it also can be a cesspool and suck your soul. And so my own view is that we all have a lot of power in our lives to be what elsewhere I've called being a peacemonger. And so a warmonger is someone that it rallies for war because war is strength, war is peace, and so on. A peacemonger says, look, peace is actually what makes the world go around. Social cooperation is what makes the world go around. And of course, there's always violence in the world. There's always conflict in the world. But I actually have a lot of scope in my own life, whether it's my family, my community, my sphere of influence, whatever that is, to actually bring about peace in the world, to make the world a better place. And that doesn't require government. And in many cases, government's at odds with that. And if people start thinking in those terms and acting upon that, then that serves as a demonstration effect for other people. And of course, That may not change. No one person may change the entire world as it pertains to war making, but each of us can do our part. And so being informed, thinking critically, and then thinking about what steps you can take in your own life, whatever that context is, to bring about more peace than existed prior, to my way of thinking, is a life well lived.
Well, I mean, that is certainly the very least we can be doing. Absolutely. And I, as I say, as part of that, I do strongly recommend that people read your book, which once again is How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite, co-authored by our friend Chris Coyne. And we should say the name of the other co-author. And who is that?
Sure. Abigail Hall, who's an economist and associate professor at University of Tampa. And we've written several books together, and she's a wonderful economist, and I always appreciate and enjoy working with her.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I will, of course, have the book linked in the video description as well as on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/2507. Chris Coyne, best of luck with this, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.